March 18, 1925, Wednesday afternoon. What touched down in southeastern Missouri at 1:01 p.m. wasn't just a tornado. It was something meteorologists had never documented before and haven't seen since. A single rotating column of wind that stayed on the ground for 219 miles. That moved at 70 miles per hour, faster than any car of that era could escape on dirt roads, faster than any horse could run. That grew to 3/4 of a mile wide, so massive you couldn't see across it, wider than most of the towns in its path. For 3.5 hours, it refused to stop, refused to weaken, refused to die. It crossed the Mississippi River without hesitating. It tore through cities and farm towns with the same merciless violence, and the people in its path had no warning. The United States Weather Bureau had forbidden forecasters from even using the word tornado in public statements. By the time you saw it coming, you had 2 minutes to live, maybe less, when it finally lifted at 4:38 p.m. It had crossed 3 states, destroyed 15,000 homes, and killed at least 695 people, more than any tornado, before or since. This is the story of the deadliest tornado in American history, the monster that wouldn't stop. The morning of March 18th started unseasonably warm across the Midwest. In Murfreesboro, Illinois, a coal mining town of 11,000 people, temperatures were already climbing towards 70 degrees in March. Unheard of. Children filed into schoolhouses, restless with the unexpected warmth. Teachers opened windows to let in the spring air. In the town of Annapolis, Missouri, barely 300 people, a shopkeeper swept his front step and remarked to a neighbor that this felt more like May than March. Farmers across southern Indiana guided their plows through soil that was finally soft enough to work. Wives hung laundry on clotheslines, grateful for the sun. Nobody was watching the southwestern sky. Nobody could. In 1925, the United States Weather Bureau had a policy that seems almost criminal in hindsight. Forecasters were forbidden from using the word tornado in any public forecast or warning. Officials believed tornado warnings would cause unnecessary panic. More than that, they insisted tornadoes were impossible to predict, so warnings would be useless anyway. Better to say nothing than to frighten people over something no one could control. So the Weather Service stayed silent, and the people living in the path of what was forming had no idea what the atmosphere was assembling above them. High above the farmland, invisible to everyone below, the atmosphere was building a bomb. Cold air from Canada collided with warm Gulf moisture. The boundary between them, sharp as a blade. But what made March 18th deadly was the wind shear. At different levels of the atmosphere, winds blowing at different speeds and directions created rotation. Rising air didn't just go up, it began to spin. By early afternoon, every ingredient was in place. Record warmth, strong wind shear, abundant moisture. What was forming would be classified today as an F5, the most violent tornado rating possible. But in 1925, there was no scale, no satellites, no radar, no way to see what was coming. The few farmers who saw it forming described something they had no words for: the entire cloud base rotating, the sky turning greenish black, then a massive funnel descending, not thin and rope-like, but impossibly wide, stretching across the landscape like a wall of churning darkness. It began to move in a nearly straight line northeast, fast, racing at 60, 70 miles per hour, covering a mile every minute. If you were 3 miles away when you saw it, you had 2.5 minutes to live. Most people had less. At 1:01 p.m., it touched down. The destruction began immediately. Farmers plowing fields in southeastern Missouri looked up to see a wall of black bearing down. Some tried to run. You cannot outrun 70 miles per hour. Their bodies were found hundreds of yards away, scattered like leaves. Then it reached Annapolis. The shopkeeper who had swept his step that morning was dead within seconds. The general store exploded. The church lifted and disintegrated. Of 300 residents, 90% of homes were destroyed. 4 people died. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone lost someone. The sound, survivors said, was like 1,000 freight trains. A roar so loud it drowned out everything else. You couldn't hear your own screams. Only the tornado, a sound like the world ending. And it kept going. It didn't stop. Most tornadoes last 5, maybe 10 minutes. This one had been on the ground for 20 minutes, had killed people, destroyed a town, and was accelerating. At 1:42 p.m., 41 minutes after touchdown, it crossed the Mississippi River. Most tornadoes dissipate over water. This one didn't notice. It struck Gorham, Illinois immediately. Population 500, killed 37 in minutes. The high school collapsed with students inside. A boy named Timothy was pulled from the wreckage 3 hours later, 14 years old, both legs crushed. He asked if his best friend had made it. They told him yes, a lie, because they couldn't bear the truth while trying to save his life. His friend's body was found the next morning. Timothy survived but spent his life remembering the friend who didn't. The tornado had now been on the ground for 90 minutes. 90 minutes of continuous destruction. And it still hadn't stopped. In Murfreesboro, a teacher named Sarah was preparing to dismiss her second-grade class for the day. She was 28 years old, had been teaching for 6 years, loved her 23 students with the fierce devotion that good teachers carry. The afternoon had been warm, her students restless, fidgeting at their desks. She'd opened the classroom windows to let in the spring air. At 2:34 p.m., the tornado reached Murfreesboro. Sarah heard it before she saw it, not thunder. Something else? Something wrong. A low roar growing louder, like a locomotive bearing down on the schoolhouse. She ran to the window. The western sky had turned black. Not storm black, solid black, rotating. A wall of darkness stretching from the ground to the heavens, moving toward her at impossible speed. She had seconds to decide, dismiss the children and send them running home, or keep them here, in a 2-story brick schoolhouse that suddenly felt like a death trap. She chose to keep them. She screamed at the children to get under their desks. Some started crying. They could hear it now, too. The roar. 23 second graders huddled under wooden desks, while Sarah stood in the center of the room, trying to think of something, anything she could do to protect them. The tornado was now 3/4 of a mile wide, wider than the town of Murfreesboro itself. 13 football fields side by side, a wall of wind and debris so massive you couldn't see across it. And it was moving at 70 miles per hour directly toward a city of 11,000 people who had received no warning at all. It struck the western edge of Murfreesboro and annihilated everything in its path. The business district exploded. Brick buildings that had stood for decades collapsed in seconds. In the residential areas, entire blocks disappeared, not damaged, disappeared. A woman named Margaret had been baking bread. Her house lifted, spun twice, came apart like matchsticks. She was found alive 3 hours later in a field 2 blocks away, still holding her bowl of dough. She had no memory of what happened. Her husband and 2 children were never found. Railway cars weighing tons were tossed like toys. The winds exceeded 300 miles per hour. Survivors describe boards driven through brick walls like arrows. A piece of straw through a telephone pole. A playing card embedded in a tree trunk. At the Longfellow School, where Sarah taught, the tornado struck with its full force. The roof came off first, then the walls. Sarah felt the floor beneath her drop away. She was flying, tumbling through the air with debris spinning around her. Wood, glass, desks, children. She hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. When she could breathe again, when she could see again, she found herself buried under rubble in what used to be the playground. She could hear children screaming, some close, some far away, some silent. She started digging. Her hands were bleeding. She couldn't tell if she was hurt. She pulled a little girl named Emma from under a beam. Emma was alive, but her leg was bent at an angle that made Sarah want to vomit. She kept digging. She found Michael. He wasn't breathing. She tried to revive him anyway, breathing into his mouth, pressing on his chest, begging him to come back. He was 7 years old. He didn't come back. All around her, the screaming continued, parents running through the ruins, calling names, rescue workers pulling bodies from collapsed buildings, the smell of gas from ruptured lines, the smell of smoke from fires beginning to spread, the smell of blood and dust and destruction. Of Sarah's 23 students, 11 survived, 12 didn't. She would count those 12 every night for the rest of her life. And the tornado kept going. It didn't stop. It had been on the ground for 2 hours, destroyed a city, killed at least 234 people in Murfreesboro alone, and it still hadn't stopped. It tore through DeSoto at 2:50 p.m., Population 600, killed 69 in minutes. A teacher named Ruth, protecting her students, was found dead with her arms wrapped around two children. Both children survived because of her. Word was spreading, but slowly. Telegraph lines were down. A farmer named John rode ahead on horseback, stopping at every farm, shouting warnings. He saved at least a dozen lives before the tornado caught him. His body was found in a ditch. His horse was found standing over him. The tornado crossed into Indiana after 4 p.m., 3 hours on the ground, 180 minutes. Still hadn't stopped. Griffin, Indiana. Population 200, every structure destroyed, 25 dead. Princeton, Indiana at 4:30 p.m. After 3.5 hours on the ground, after more than 200 miles, still an F5. 45 people died, a mother and her 3 children killed in their cellar when their house collapsed. The father came home from work to find his entire family gone. At 4:38 p.m., after 3 hours and 37 minutes of continuous destruction, the tornado finally lifted. Silence. The silence after a tornado is unlike anything else. Survivors describe it as complete, absolute. A silence so profound it feels like the world has ended. The roar that had dominated everything for hours was gone. In its place, nothing. Then, slowly, other sounds emerged. Crying, screaming, moans of pain, calls for help. Sarah pulled herself from the rubble and looked around at what used to be Murfreesboro. She couldn't recognize it. Entire blocks were gone. Landmarks that had oriented her whole life had vanished. She didn't know which direction she was facing. The world had been rearranged. She started walking. She had to find survivors, had to help. Her hands were still bleeding, but she didn't care. She pulled people from collapsed buildings. She comforted children who were screaming for parents who would never answer. She held the hand of a dying man who kept asking for his wife. Sarah told him his wife was fine, another lie, because the woman's body was visible 20 feet away, and the man didn't need to know that before he died. All across the tornado's path, the same scene was playing out. In Annapolis and Gorham and DeSoto and Griffin and Princeton and a dozen small towns in between, survivors emerging from cellars to find their world destroyed, walking through ruins looking for loved ones, finding some alive, finding some dead, finding... The death toll was catastrophic. At least 695 people killed. Entire families wiped out. The injured numbered over 2,000. Hospitals that remained standing were overwhelmed. Doctors worked by candlelight, amputating crushed limbs, trying to save the dying. They ran out of morphine. They ran out of bandages. In Murfreesboro, bodies were laid out in rows in the town square, waiting to be identified. Some never were. The line stretched for 100 feet. Sarah walked it looking for her students. She found 3 of them. She broke down when she saw Michael. His mother was kneeling beside him, touching his face, making a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite screaming. Sarah knelt beside her and held her. The response moved slowly. Roads were blocked, tracks were twisted. The Red Cross mobilized, but it took time. The survivors took care of each other. They shared what little food remained. They pulled the injured from rubble. They buried the dead in mass graves because there was no choice. The rebuilding began before the dead were all buried. President Coolidge authorized federal disaster relief, one of the first times the government provided aid on such a scale. But the scars ran deeper than buildings. Survivors suffered what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Sarah never taught again. She couldn't walk into a classroom without seeing the 12 faces. Children who survived developed terror of storms that lasted their entire lives. The tri-state tornado changed how America thought about tornadoes. Before March 18, 1925, the Weather Bureau's policy of silence was based on the assumption that warnings were impossible and useless. After 695 deaths, after entire towns erased, that assumption could no longer hold. Change came slowly, but in 1948, 2 Air Force meteorologists issued the first tornado forecast, breaking the decades-old prohibition. In 1950, a nationwide severe weather warning system was established. The tornado warning sirens that sound in towns today, the forecasts that give people time to shelter, all trace back to lessons learned from the tri-state tornado. Every life saved by a tornado warning is a small redemption of the 695 who died when no warning came. There's a cemetery in Murfreesboro where many of the victims are buried. Some graves have names, some have only dates. March 18th, 1925. A Wednesday afternoon that should have been ordinary. That started with children walking home from school and farmers working their fields, and a teacher opening her classroom windows to let in the spring air. Sarah is buried there now. She lived to be 84 years old, but she never married, never had children of her own. The 12 students she lost were enough. Every March 18th for the rest of her life, she visited their graves, she brought flowers, she spoke their names aloud, she made sure they were remembered. The tri-state tornado has been gone for nearly a century. The towns it destroyed were rebuilt. Life returned to the river valleys and farm fields of Missouri and Illinois and Indiana. But the memory remains, in the stories passed down through families, in the cemeteries where the victims lie, in the warning sirens that sound when the sky turns dark. The monster that wouldn't stop taught America that silence in the face of danger is not protection, that warnings matter, that minutes can mean the difference between life and death. 219 miles, 3 hours and 37 minutes, 695 lives. The numbers tell the story of the deadliest tornado in American history, but the real story lives in the names. In the 12 children, Sarah counted every night for the rest of her life. In Michael, who was 7. In Timothy, who asked about his friend. In the warning sirens bought with blood, sounding across the Midwest every time the sky turns green and the wind begins to shift. The monster that wouldn't stop, and the lesson we couldn't forget.